All right, new bombshell just dropped on us by Ming-Chi Kuo about the redesigned MacBook Pro, supposedly coming at the end of next year. So this is not necessarily the next generation MacBook Pro because there's still supposed to be just another spec bump year where we get an M5 chip with the same design, maybe some new networking connectivity chips. Maybe they have a special version of the M1 chip or something. But after the M5 launches within the next 6 months or so, Apple is supposedly working on a redesigned version of the MacBook Pro, one of my favorite Apple products of all time. The MacBook Pro actually predates the iPhone, if you can believe that. And not only is it rumored to adopt an OLED display like the iPad Pro already has, but now Ming-Chi Kuo is saying it will also feature a touch display, which is kind of a controversial thing in the Apple sphere for a while, because of course Windows laptops have had touchscreens for, over a decade now. It's been around, ever since the Windows 8 era of trying to blend together tablet and laptop software. And Apple was actually pretty deliberately against adding touchscreens to Macs. In fact, Steve Jobs famously said that it made for great demo, but your arm and your hand gets tired, and they thought that their energy and time was better spent optimizing the Magic Trackpad and just having an overall great traditional laptop experience. And I'm actually not against Apple prioritizing that. The MacBooks have sold incredibly well between the Airs and the Pros, still incredibly popular in the workplace and at home, and the idea of messing with that to make it feel a little bit more tablet-like, I have to admit that has me a little bit annoyed / concerned about the future of the MacBook Pro, because frankly that's not really something that I feel like the MacBook Pro needs, but Apple has been able to in the past execute in ways that a lot of us didn't anticipate. Like for example, recently with the iPhone 17 series, I think a lot of people's favorite feature might end up being the center stage camera, the front-facing camera, the same camera I'm using right now, except I'm not on Timmy's nice list, so I'm still on the 16 Pro Max at the time of recording. But all the rumors, all the leaks were technically correct. They said that the front-facing camera would go from 12 megapixels to about 24, and so a lot of us just thought, oh, okay, selfie camera will get a little sharper, not a big deal. Even me, even in all my leaks and rumor videos, I was like, it's probably not going to make that big a difference. It's just slightly bigger sensor, slightly sharper selfies. At the end of the day, the lens is probably not changing all that much, so it probably won't make a big difference. And then we see the execution. We see how it's implemented, and now Apple is letting you take really wide shots without having to rotate your phone into landscape. So you can keep your phone in portrait mode, fit everybody in the shot, and that's where, again, we see these scenarios where the leaks and rumors are technically correct, but Apple finds a way to still surprise us. An older example would be the dynamic island. For a long, long time, it was rumored that Apple was moving away from the notch in favor of having this just oval-shaped hole cut out at the top of the phone, and it sounded weird. It sounded a little bizarre, and while technically those leaks were true, we didn't expect iOS to implement it in such a way that it felt extremely natural, in fact helpful, to the point that even if we completely get rid of the dynamic island hardware in the future, a lot of us are probably still going to want some kind of software version of that little hole at the top that dynamically changes based on what you're doing and what you're looking at. So I'm hoping there's some execution in store for the MacBook Pro now that it's rumored to support a touchscreen where we go, I don't know if macOS needs a touch interface. I feel like it's been optimized so well for a point and click. And at first glance, when I read that report, I'm like, oh God, does that mean macOS has to look like iPadOS now? Like all of the menu options and buttons all have to get blown up because they have to be big enough that your finger can precisely tap on them. And that's going to be weird compared to just using a mouse, which can be far more precise and clickable. I was always in favor of Apple just hey, if you want to have a hybrid platform where you can use a keyboard and mouse and you can use a touch interface simultaneously, that's what the iPad should be. Let the iPad be the gap. Let that be the bridge between iOS and macOS. And if you want to have a keyboard and mouse plus touch interface, use iPadOS, okay? It's great for that. It's optimized well for touch, but can also do some keyboard and mouse-like tasks. But let Mac continue to just be Mac. Does the Mac really need to also be a hybrid operating system where you can touch and use the trackpad and keyboard? I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic. I really hope Apple has an execution in store that could be a lot better than just basically bringing over what they've already done with iPadOS to the Mac. I also just feel like the MacBook Pro display would just get way more fingerprinty. But I guess at the end of the day, you could always just not use it. You could just be the guy who just never touches the MacBook display, or hopefully there's a way to turn it off. But I'm not completely against the idea of a touchscreen on a MacBook Pro, despite me prioritizing macOS as a point-and-click interface over all these years. However, I'm just not in favor of it being the primary display. I know this is a stretch, but I hope Ming-Chi Kuo is mostly wrong and it turns out that they just end up bringing back the touch bar, because as much as people hated it, I feel like it was never properly taken advantage of, and there is a way you can have traditional function row keys and a touch bar. I don't actually think a lot of the people who were criticizing the touch bar were actually hating the touch bar itself. I think a lot of that criticism actually stemmed down to just people being upset at the removal of the function keys. Touch bar in itself is not necessarily bad. It's just don't replace the physical keys if people want to use them for volume or display brightness, or of course having an escape key. Having those be physical is fine, but just leave the touch bar up there for picking emojis when you're writing texts or emails, especially Genmoji. If Apple wants to keep pushing the Apple Intelligence thing so hard, it's not as easy to do when you have to press the function key every time you want to pull up the emoji picker, or the predictive text, so when you're typing and you have autocomplete on the touch bar. If I could just reach up and tap those, I appreciated it. I actually really liked it. I would personally pay extra on my MacBook if it meant I could still have the touch bar, but it felt like Apple kept believing it had to be one or the other. You couldn't have touch bar and function keys. You had to pick one, and I don't think you should. Similar to how Apple lets you charge your MacBook with MagSafe or Type-C still relatively quickly, they should give Pro users the option. So I'm in favor of the touch bar still being an option, but I know I'm kind of weird like that, and a lot of people don't agree with me. But how do you guys feel about a touchscreen actually coming to the Mac? I felt like they would never do this. Steve Jobs probably would have been against it, and I'm sure some of you have probably commented that already. But also keep in mind, when Steve Jobs was handing off the role of CEO to Tim Cook, he also said, "Don't do what I would do," which is kind of paradoxical in a way. It means that if Apple avoids doing things because they think Steve Jobs wouldn't have liked it, in a way, Steve Jobs wouldn't like that either. In a sense, I think we shouldn't be completely closed off to the idea of Apple pursuing things that Steve wouldn't have liked, because there's all kinds of things Apple has done that Steve was on the record, at least, for being somewhat against, like multiple, much bigger screen size options for the iPhones or a stylus on the iPad. I think the iPhone lineup has gotten way more intricate and complicated than it was in the Steve Jobs era, but who knows? Maybe if Steve was alive today, he would have seen the opportunity for greater market growth and more diversification of lineups, and maybe he would have come around to the ideas that Tim has now implemented today. But would one of those ideas be a touchscreen on a MacBook? Are you guys against it like I am? Are you in favor of the touch bar coming back? Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.